The hide-and-seek test is probably one of the most important events from the first season, especially when it comes to the test with Team A. Not only did it provide for another outlet to portray Kun's genius, but it was also intended to explain why position battles and team compositions matter. Because of the anime's heavy focus on the plot, many position-defining details were excluded, some of which served to explain why certain events happened the way they did during the test. Like how Quant was able to easily dismantle this team of rookie regulars, or why Kun's perceived inexperience as a lightbearer was the leading cause of his plan's overall success. So let's go through episode 8 and see what exactly we missed out on. But first, today's video is sponsored by Crunchyroll. In case you didn't know, Crunchyroll is what I personally use to watch Tower of God, and it's what I'll be using to watch God of High School and ReZero Season 2 in the summer. So if you want complete HD ad-free access to any of these new anime, then feel free to use crunchyroll.com/AniNews to get a 14-day free trial of Crunchyroll Premium today. And considering that they've partnered with Webtoon, you can definitely expect to see more manhwa-based adaptations from them in the near future. Noblesse is already one of the few to be confirmed. Just like all the other anime and manga on Crunchyroll, these will all be available to stream with professional subtitles on pretty much any device. So go ahead and use crunchyroll.com/AniNews or the link in the description to get your 14-day free trial of Crunchyroll Premium today. Now, let's get back to the video. Although the general idea of the hide-and-seek test was explained, there was a few more intricacies to it that made certain game-changing decisions make more sense. But in order to understand why these things happened the way they did, we first need to understand the entire setup to the test itself. In terms of grading, each individual was being assessed by their own position teachers. Then, team performance as a whole was being graded by test director Yu, giving each regular 2 opportunities to gain points. Now, the first key thing to note was that the test area was defined by 3 distinct zones. A safety zone, which is pretty much the starting point for each team, the seeking zone where Quant can actively hunt the it, and the exits where teams should try to get their it. The thing about this setup though is that the regulars can't have their tags stolen while in the safety zone. Quant can't do anything to any member of any team while they're in there. That's an important thing to note for later. So with that defining the arena, the other key aspect is the badge itself. It's designed with a sensor that immediately stops the test once touched, and if you were lucky enough to be the one to tag Quants, then as an individual you would gain 2,000 points. Keep in mind that the team itself wouldn't receive those points, only the person who stole the tag would. It pretty much guaranteed a passing score. Now, putting all these regulars against a ranker definitely wasn't a fair matchup, especially if the ranker was able to use their full powers. That's why Quant's options were very limited from the start. He could neither use his items nor strengthen his body. The only thing he could do was produce a single instance of Shinsu. A single bang of Tenmyun and Tensu. This wasn't enough to kill anyone, but it was definitely enough to put some cool scout techniques into action. Even with this handicap though, the odds still seemed pretty stacked against the regulars. The only comfort that Kun and Shibisu could find came from the fact that Quant looked to be the weakest ranker out of all of them. So, as they discussed what type of approach to take while in the safety zone, Kun began setting things in motion to achieve his master plan. First, he took leadership of his team. Then he came up with the idea to catch the ranker rather than run away. This was quite the controversial plan, because no regular in their right mind would ever think to compete against a ranker. It truly was an impossible task. But what Kun knew as well was that no ranker would ever expect a regular to challenge them, especially one like Quant. He was one of those people who had a sort of ego to them. Not only that, but he also hated to lose more than anything. That's why this plan, which was the most unexpected, also had the highest chance of success. Quant won't be able to expect an ambush if he literally can't fathom it existing. For someone like him, the only option the regulars have is to run away. So Kun believed that using Quant's ego against him would give them a single chance of securing Quant's tag. At least that's how Kun wanted to portray it. He needed to make this plan seem logical enough to convince all the others it was worth trying. And that's exactly what happened. So with Shibisu as bait, they sent him out into the dark by himself with a single lighthouse to brighten the path. One thing to note about this arena was that without a lighthouse, everything was in complete darkness. It was intended to make navigation much harder as well as test the capabilities of the Lightbearer. Which, if you're still confused as to what this position does, then my video that explains all of them would be super helpful. especially to give context to a lot of the other things that I'll be talking about here. For example, one of the many things we covered was the device known as an observer that Shibisu was shown to be using in this moment. This was a very common tool for a scout to have because their job was to deliver information from behind enemy lines to their lightbearer. The observer made this job easier by transmitting visual data to the lighthouse. So Shibisu was using it as a sort of camera to try and find Quant's position, though Quant wasn't so useless as to not know how to avoid being detected by it. He was able to sneak up on Shibisu without being seen. That being said, Quant knew from the beginning that Shibisu was just bait. Even though he figured their plan was to distract him, he still decided to fall for their trap just so that he could show how futile their efforts were. Now, because it was Shibisu who was the bait, Quant decided to showcase to his student just how strong a scout needed to be in order to climb the tower. First, he immediately identified the potential number of threats. Then he charged forward to bait out the Spare Bearer's attack, which opened up a window for him to take out the lighthouse. Remember, removing the lighthouse not only removed all lights from the battlefield, but it also disrupted the team's communications. It was practically the same thing as taking out their center of command. This was one of the key things that Quant wanted Shibisu to learn. A scout always had to deal with the high possibility of confronting a large number of enemies at the same time. It just came as part of the job of infiltrating into enemy territory. So, in the case of ever getting caught, the best option would always be to remove the enemy's eyes. Not only does that eliminate the chance of getting hit by the Spare Bearer's attacks, but it also gives the scout the ability to choose when he wants to engage the enemy, especially if that scout is well trained enough to be able to read Shinsu in the dark. This is exactly what Quant did in order to detect where his enemies were, and it allowed him to quickly close the gap between himself and Shibisu. The thing is, this was exactly how Kun expected Quant to react. As someone who's from the 10 families, Kun is very knowledgeable on the skills it takes to become a ranker. That's why he decided to wait for Quant to believe he had the complete upper hand before finally engaging with their second lighthouse. His plan actually would have worked had Quant not used his one instance of Shinsu to activate the technique Black Fish. This was an advanced body reinforcement technique typically used by scouts to block out the light of a lighthouse. It removed their ability to see him without actually removing the lighthouse itself. Normally, a skilled lightbearer would be able to counter this by using a reverse technique, but Kun was still very inexperienced when it came to managing lighthouses. Currently, he could only use one at a time, or two at max if one was already stationary. Now, one thing about this scene was that Anak was using what's called a reel. This is often the fisherman's main weapon of choice. What it does is extend their range of combat by shooting a hook or needle towards the enemy. By attaching the green April to the end of her reel, Anak was able to use Shinsu to freely manipulate the line and attack from a distance. What we saw Anak do was actually one of the main offensive patterns that fishermen tend to use. It mainly consists of establishing control of the high ground, then using the reel to inhibit their opponent's movements. The reason for this isn't so much as to eliminate the opponent themselves, but instead to give the Spare Bearer more openings to land attacks. Anak and Endodisi were currently the only two regulars capable of using this type of weapon, but unfortunately Anak was neither fast nor skilled enough to beat the reaction time of Quant's scout instincts. This made Quant believe that he'd been underestimated, and as we saw, he didn't really like that very much. Everyone thought that he was going to violently end the test right there, but instead he mercifully gave them a second chance. It wasn't just a 100-second grace period though. He actually gave them a full 32 minutes and 13 seconds to try and get to the exit. Not only did this show how big of an arena this test was being held in, but it also showed that Quant knew exactly how long it would take for Anak to get near the exit. He made sure to give himself ample time to not only catch Anak at the bridge, but also stop along the way to give all the other regulars a lesson on why he's the best. But here's where Kun's genius begins to shine. We already know that the way Team A's test played out was completely in accordance with Kun's plan. However, Lidodo couldn't understand what the big picture was. The only thing he could see was the absurdity of a regular trying to take on a ranker, especially since that regular was someone who was from the 10 families. On the other hand, Yu was able to see past this, and he found Kun to be taking the test rather well. He knew that the whole logic behind using Quant's ego against him was just stuff that he made up to get his teammates to go along with his plan. If he didn't, then things wouldn't have gone so well for him. I think it's worth pointing out though that at no point during the webtoon did they make it seem that this was the case. Other than what Yu had said as a hint, we were made to believe that Kun was genuinely trying to pass the test the entire time. It went to make the reveal of his betrayal that much more shocking. Anyway, after about 31 minutes, Kun's team chose to lead Anak to an exit that would force Quant down a narrow passageway. That way they would have 2 opportunities to ambush him. One of these was in the stairwell similar to what we saw in the anime, and the way it played out was pretty much the same. Though the reason that Quant was able to continue to hide in the dark was because he still had his bang active from when he used Blackfish the first time. He never got rid of his first activation of Shinsu, so he was just reusing it to hide his body from the lighthouse once again. This let him walk right into the ambush without getting spotted. The only thing the regulars could do now was just attack at random, which really only just made it easier for Quant to pick them off one by one. The scene with Quant fighting Amigo was intended to show just how much a Spare Bearer would be at a disadvantage if they tried to fight at close range. Scouts typically have the fittest body out of all the positions, so it would be very easy for a scout to take on a Light Bearer or Spare Bearer in a one-on-one. However, when a Light Bearer and Spare Bearer worked together, well, that's when a scout would be in trouble. If the scout ended up in a position where they were spotted, the Spare Bearer could combine their power with the Light Bearer's lighthouse to hit a target from dozens of kilometers away. It was a very deadly combination technique, but that was something far too advanced for any regular to do on the floor of test. Right now, Kun's team was simply getting toyed with, especially when Quant snuck up behind Shibisu for the second time. This whole encounter was stretched out into a comedic scene that actually went to further develop Shibisu and Anak's relationship. It was after realizing it was impossible to beat Quant to the exit that Anak figured it'd be best to just try and fight him in a more open area. To her, fighting on the bridge would have been a guaranteed loss. At least with a bit more room, she could try and put up a fight. That's when we see Shibisu trying to hold Quant back so that Anak could make it to the exit. Aside from his weird comments, what Shibisu was trying to do was show Anak that it was okay to rely on other people. You see, Kun had told Shibisu that Anak was hiding something from the rest of them. He didn't know what exactly it was, but he wanted Anak to know that he would be there to help her if he could. It was honestly a pretty wholesome speech, up until he started spewing his garbage again. Nevertheless, his words did seem to resonate with Anak as she decided to make a dash for the exit again. So, as Shibisu held onto Quant's leg, he tried to make an opening for First Emperor to use his Scorching Fist of Death. At least by being a minor inconvenience, Shibisu could prevent Quant from using his Blackfish technique to hide. It got to the point that Quant was getting rather annoyed by it. The only reason he hadn't killed any of them so far was that he didn't want to be responsible for any of their deaths. Sure, this may have sounded cool to Quant when he was saying it in his head, but saying it out loud just made Lidodo and Yu laugh at him. So, with Quant's patience now running low, he decided to just ignore all the other regulars and head straight to Anak. Based on her current position, she would need at least 15 more minutes to make it to the exit. Kun knew that this wouldn't be enough time. He had to think quickly if he was going to come up with a plan to beat him, though fooling Quant wasn't going to be so easy. There were a couple things that made his story seem as if it was a lie. The first was the obvious bait to make him jump off the bridge. The second was the presence of only a single lighthouse. Quant was aware that Kun was capable of using 2 lighthouses, so the presence of only one led him to the conclusion that the other was being used as an object for Anak to stand on. It was a very standard tactic to use the lighthouse as an object. It's what was taught to the light bearers in their classes. That's why Quant was able to figure it out so easily. Now, because Quant believed this to be an oversight on Kun's part, he decided to give Kun a lesson on the lighthouses themselves. Aside from being a cube that emits light, gathers information, and transmits commands, the lighthouse itself was a device made from suspendium, a special type of mineral that floats in Shinsu. The more pure this ore, the more buoyant it would be, and that would result in a higher quality lighthouse. Though the same could be said for pockets and inventories as well. They can float too because they also have suspendium in them. And just as you'd expect, the higher percentage of pure suspendium a device has, the more expensive it will be. That's why the lighthouses that regulars like Kun possess are often made with such little suspendium that they need to be kept afloat via Shinsu manipulation. What this means is that lighthouses can only be kept afloat within a certain radius of their light bearer. If that light bearer loses consciousness or moves out of that radius, then their lighthouses will end up falling. That was the basis of Quant's reasoning to jump with Kun. He would force Kun out of his radius of control, which would in turn cause Anak to fall alongside them. This would then give Quant the opportunity to grab her tag. But here's where a significant change was made to the anime, one that sort of diminished the level of planning that Kun put into this. Using his bag, Kun was able to hide that he'd been secretly hanging on to the other lighthouse the entire time. Now, how he did that was what's important. Kun was using a high-quality item known as a pulley. Just like his bag, it was something that he stole from his father's personal treasury, an item suitable to be used by rankers because the pulley was made from pure suspendium. Because of this, it allowed for it to be easily set up and manipulated within Kun's field of Shinsu control. The pulley's rope could also be extended in either direction at the user's discretion. So, well before Quant had arrived, Kun tied one end of the rope to his bag and the other end to his lighthouse. He then kept both the rope and the pulley in invisible mode and waited for Quant to jump. So it wasn't something as simple as Anak using her green April to save Kun. And just so that this item doesn't seem too random, we've actually seen it used once before, back when Bam had to tempt Endodacy by dangling food in front of her. After this was just the whole reveal about Kun's master plan. But before the second test would begin, there was a small break in between so that each of the teachers could evaluate Team A's performance. Based on what they saw, every person there performed about as well as they expected them to. Well, everyone except for the Lightbearer, who performed exceptionally well. Though Lidido wasn't so sure whether to give him a good grade or not. Unlike the other rankers, Lidido was the only one to see that Kun helped Quant get back on the bridge. Surely this betrayal of his team was something that warranted a deduction of his points. Yet, he still couldn't easily dismiss the fact that Kun's prowess as a Lightbearer was extraordinary. That's when you had to point out that Kun didn't betray his team at all. He just made the rather shocking choice to put his own journey on the line in exchange for helping another's. The thing is, Kun should know very well that climbing the tower requires sacrifice. It's an unavoidable truth that you're going to have to leave behind your heaviest burdens. If that was the case, then why was it that Kun made the choice to keep one of them? It just didn't make sense. Out of all the things that Kun's plan was, you found it most of all to be arrogant, and it seemed to bother him in a way that Lidido couldn't quite understand. But that's pretty much the majority of episode 8. Next week we'll cover the second test as we get into episode 9. And if you still happen to be confused as to what the positions are and what they do, then be sure to check out my last video which went through all of them. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Crunchyroll once again for sponsoring this video. Don't forget, you can use crunchyroll.com/AniNews or the link in the description to get your 14-day free trial of Crunchyroll Premium today. Now, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!